For a kids show about underwater life, SpongeBob is a surprisingly decent crash course on political ideologies, because almost every major character in the show resembles a real-world type of government or some kind of economic system. Some of it's obvious, but some are buried so deep you'd need a marine biology degree to spot it. And the most obvious place to start is none other than the biggest penny-pinching crustacean on the 7 seas. The owner of Bikini Bottom's most successful restaurant, and a guy who once rebranded it just to sell out his best employees. And if you had to pick one character to stand in for capitalism in your wacky essay, it's him. I mean, there's no real contest here in Bikini Bottom. Capitalism, in the most oversimplified terms possible, is an economic system where private people own the businesses instead of the government. The owners, or certain shareholders, will decide pretty much everything, such as what to sell, what to charge, and how much to pay their workers. And the Krusty Krab pretty much fits this definition. It's just Krabs who owns the place, sets the prices, and decides what a Krabby Patty costs and whether you're getting cheese on it. And capitalism as a system has some pretty well-known weak points. One of the biggest ones is wealth inequality, since most of the money ends up with the people at the top and not a lot makes its way down.
Wow! That's more than I make in a year!
It's also not a secret that Krabs would be more than willing to do pretty much anything if it means more money in his pocket. At the end of the day, if capitalism had a mascot, it would be Eugene H. Krabs. And honestly, he'd probably try to charge royalties for that claim. Now, of course, every capitalist king has a rival. And Krabs' biggest rival has been losing the same fight for 25 years. Sheldon J. Plankton. You would think a guy who runs a shady restaurant across the street would also represent some kind of economic system. But I honestly think he doesn't, since Plankton has bigger dreams than money, which is to rule. Now, of course, we've seen that Plankton wants to steal the Krabby Patty recipe every now and then, indicating that he, too, wants to have a successful restaurant like his childhood friend. However, when all else fails, Plankton doesn't seem to mind framing Krabs for stealing King Neptune's crown, taking over the Krusty Krab, or making his own utopia called Planktopolis. As far as ruling goes, we've seen Plankton dreaming about ruling the city more than once in this show. That being said, you could honestly make a case that Plankton goes a step further than just dictatorship. Since Plankton seems really keen on those mind control helmets, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that he also wants to control what people think, which technically puts him closer to totalitarianism, a version of authoritarianism where the government doesn't just rule you, but also owns your thoughts too. So yeah, take your pick. Either way, I don't think he's doing a good job turning his ideology into reality, since he almost never really succeeds. And even if we're counting his Plan Z from the movie as one, Plankton's reign of terror gets undone by SpongeBob and Patrick singing a goofy goober song, which, to be fair, is a more dignified ending than most real dictators get. And the opposite of one guy owning everything is everyone owning everything, which brings us to the laziest example of shared property in all of Bikini Bottom, Patrick's star. Now, at first, I thought Patrick's political ideology was communism, right? Communism, in the simplest possible terms, is an economic system where there's no private ownership, which means everything kind of belongs to the community, which also means nobody really owns their stuff because the whole point is sharing just about everything. And Patrick kind of resembles this philosophy more than anyone in the show. For one, he loves to raid SpongeBob's fridge just whenever he wants, and even the Krusty Krab for that matter. He also loves to borrow pretty much everything from SpongeBob's house, like his washing machine or even his pants, without asking. Arguably, you could think of Patrick as someone who believes the concept of yours and mine is just a lie invented by capitalists. Sounds like a true commie to me, which also ironically reminds me of an episode with a similar title, Yours, Mine, and Mine. There is, however, one tiny problem with Patrick representing communism. The actual ideology kind of expects everyone to contribute to the collective. Like, you have to produce something to share to be a part of society. Meanwhile, Patrick does not produce anything. Patrick has been unemployed for the majority of the show, with brief and traumatic exceptions such as Pat No Pay and No Hat for Pat. So if Patrick were dropped into an actual communist state, he'd probably get arrested for being a freeloader within the first week. which ironically makes him both the most communist character in Bikini Bottom and the worst possible communist at the same time. Which is why I think Patrick is closer to what we call egoism. And just like the name suggests, egoism, in the philosophical sense, is the idea that everything a person does is ultimately for themselves. Even the nice things, or generous things. The egoist will and always does what feels right to them, while ignoring societal pressure and feels zero guilt about it. Of course, I'm not saying he fully resembles egoism in his character, but there are some episodes to make a case about it. So yeah, either that or communism, or maybe both. Maybe communism on Monday and egoism on Tuesday, or whatever he's feeling that morning. Now, from a guy who lives entirely for himself, we go to a guy who'd rather live as far away from everyone else as possible, Squidward Tentacles. Now, I'm really feeling conservatism for Squidward, just for the fact that he hates noise, he hates his neighbors. What's more, he values certain orders in life, especially on art, and maybe the quiet enjoyment of his own hobbies. As for conservatism itself, in its simplest form, is the belief that society works best when things stay the way they are. In other words, tradition over disruption. Arguably, his whole arc with SpongeBob is essentially a conservative experience in itself. A story about a loud, chaotic outsider who keeps disrupting his routine, and Squidward keeps demanding it stop. But then, you remember episodes like Squidville. In the episode, Squidward moves to a gated community called Tentacle Acres, where literally every resident lives an identical life to him. The community also explicitly preserved exclusivity since they don't allow other species in. That's not really conservatism, is it? If anything, it sounds more similar to communism. That's why I think there's a small chance of Squidward actually resembling ethno-communalism, a community organized around shared identity where resources are distributed equally within the group, but the group itself is defined by who gets to belong. And the reason why I think this fits Squidward better than just plain conservatism is because he doesn't actually want a traditional society with class structures and limited competition. He wants a society where everyone is like him, where his cultural preferences are the norm, and where he doesn't have to deal with anyone different. You could think of it like he wants to live in a bubble. And Tentacle Acres is the bubble. However, toward the end of the episode, Squidward also seems to be fed up with Tentacle Acres pretty quickly, since there's really not that much to it. So yeah, maybe he's a conservative after all. Up to this point, we've covered 3 of the worst run lives in television. A miser, a wannabe dictator, and a starfish who has never held a job. It's about time we talked about someone who actually has their stuff together. Sandy Cheeks. So, Sandy is a scientist, an inventor, and I think the most formally educated character in Bikini Bottom. And she loves to solve problems with engineering. And if Sandy has to run any kind of political agenda in Bikini Bottom, it would be a technocracy. To put it really simply, technocracy is a system where the people in charge are the ones with technical or scientific expertise, as opposed to politicians or businessmen. However, I don't think Sandy actually wants to rule anyone. She just wants to do her experiments and occasionally karate chop SpongeBob. Meanwhile, technocracy as a system requires the experts to actively run things, which means less and less time for herself. Now, even though there's a debate on how the best person for a leader is the one that doesn't want to, like Plato said, Sandy isn't really someone who you'd call sane herself. So maybe the better answer for Sandy is rugged individualism, a belief that a person should rely on their own skills, work ethic, and self-sufficiency rather than depending on society or government to take care of them. It's deeply tied to American frontier mythology, which is a fancy way of saying it's deeply tied to Texas. And Sandy is, to a degree that becomes almost comedic, very Texan. I always get the feeling that she has a worldview where the strong, the smart, and the self-reliant don't need anyone else's system to thrive, which is true to her case. So, by that definition, I think it's more fitting to call Sandy a frontier individualist who happens to be a scientist, if that makes any sense. But enough about Sandy, and that leaves us with the smallest, slimiest, and possibly smartest character left on the list, Gary the Snail. I don't know about you, but there's something telling me Gary is an anarchist. I mean, Gary doesn't follow rules, even though Gary is owned, in theory, by SpongeBob, but anyone who has watched the show knows that ownership is largely symbolic. SpongeBob feeds him, cleans up after him, and structures his entire morning routine around him. If anything, Gary owns SpongeBob. Anarchy, as a political concept, is the rejection of governing authority. There is no obligation to obey anyone. And Gary sounds like that person to me. In Gary Takes a Bath, SpongeBob spends an entire episode trying to coax, trick, threaten, and bargain Gary into the bathtub. Gary refuses, escapes, and outwits him at every turn. SpongeBob has zero authority over him, and Gary knows it. But there's an episode that takes this much further than just rebellious pet. A pal for Gary. SpongeBob spends the entire episode dismissing Gary's warnings, taking the new pet's side and accusing Gary of being jealous. Gary survives only by his own wits and, by the end, has learned a very clear lesson. SpongeBob cannot be trusted to protect him. That episode proved he's a creature who knows for sure that his owner can't always be a reliable authority figure, and has chosen to operate independently as a result. But since Gary also does obey SpongeBob every now and then, he could also be autonomism. And yes, this is a real political philosophy, not something that I'm making up. Autonomism is the belief that individuals and small groups should govern themselves rather than submit to larger institutions, especially when those institutions have proven incompetent or harmful. Now, autonomists don't necessarily reject all cooperation. They specifically reject imposed authority. They might follow their own rules most of the time, and they could check out structures they don't trust if needed. That's pretty much Gary's whole life, right? So that's 6 characters, 6 ideologies, and a surprising amount of political theory that I'm, oversimplifying. So tell me, how many mistakes have I made this time? And if you've got a different read on any of these characters, I definitely want to hear it. Because half the fun of a show this old is that everyone has to have their own way to look at it. The funny thing about all this is that even though I'm definitely taking some of it further than it should, at the end of the day, Bikini Bottom is a working society, with workers and bosses and rivalries and rules, and once you build a society, even an underwater one made of sponges and starfish, you end up with politics whether you mean to or not. You probably didn't sign up for a civics lesson when you turned on SpongeBob, but when you let a handful of cartoonists shape 20 years of a fictional society without anyone steering, the worldview of that society starts leaking out into every frame, whether anyone meant it to or not. I broke down exactly how that process worked in our last video. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out, because it explains why a cartoon about a talking sponge ended up smuggling this much political theory in the first place. I'll see you on the next dive.